Hi everyone, this is Dr. Young, and the course is Western Civilization 1. I want to talk today about politics in the High Middle Ages, specifically about the rise and development of a few important Western European kingdoms. And this is not an exhaustive list of kingdoms. There were several formed in that period that we're not going to mention, at least not at any length. But they're nevertheless interesting. Just to give you a couple examples, so looking at a map of Europe here, there was a very stable kingdom down here in northeastern Spain in this region known as Aragon or Catalonia. And the Kingdom of Aragon in the 13th and 14th centuries was a prominent kingdom with some quite creative rulers that exerted an influence all across Western Europe. It's been the subject of a lot of studies by historians. Another kingdom, and we did mention this briefly, was a kingdom set up here, kind of the capital was in Palermo down here in Sicily, but it also encompassed much of southern Italy. And this was a Norman kingdom, so these people originally came from up here in Normandy, and before that they of course came from Scandinavia. They were Vikings. In the 11th century, a group of these Normans came down through the Strait of Gibraltar and ousted the Muslims who had ruled over Sicily for a couple of centuries at that point, ousted them from there, and set up this very powerful kingdom. And in fact, the founder of this Norman dynasty in Sicily, whose name was Robert, fully intended to go all the way over to Constantinople and to conquer the Byzantine Empire. And in fact, his army had won a couple of smashing victories when some matters in Greece over the Byzantine armies, when some matters called him back home, and I think Robert figured that he could return at any point and retake or sort of pick up where he left off in the taking of Constantinople. He never made it back there, but that just goes to show how powerful this kingdom was. Other kingdoms developed out of the breakup of the Carolingian Empire, and I want to talk primarily today about a couple of these. One is what comes to be called Germany, what was called in the Middle Ages the Reich, or the Empire, the German Empire, sometimes even referred to as the Roman Empire, and the ruler of it as the Roman Emperor, for reasons that we may talk about here. I'm also going to talk about France, which was, back in the 9th century, the Western Frankish kingdom founded by Charles the Bald, the grandson of Charlemagne. And this had fallen into some disrepair and sort of gets revitalized in the around the turn of the millennium. We're also going to spend some time talking about England. And in conjunction with these conversations, we're going to talk about the High Medieval Church, and specifically the popes, who constituted in this period kings, or even perhaps emperors in their own right. They were very important political players. They weren't just clergymen who removed themselves from political affairs. The popes were intimately involved in these sorts of things, and so we need to talk about the papacy as well. So I'm going to start by talking about the German Empire. When the Carolingian Empire, or Carolingian kingdoms that were created by the Treaty of Verdun began to fragment and fall apart starting in the 9th century. Excuse me. Got some allergies today, so hopefully that won't be too distracting. Anyway, as this broke up into smaller and smaller parts, there were some powerful nobles who seized control of territories. Some of these were descended from the counts, the main governmental office created by Charlemagne, and some of them took on the title of Duke, which was an even older title, going back to that of Roman officials. There were powerful dukes, for instance, in this region of Germany called Bavaria. Um, there were powerful dukes up here in this region called Saxony. And there were other nobles who had, and some of these nobles, by the way, were not just secular authorities, they were also churchmen, the bishops of the very important episcopal cities in Germany, for instance. And so you can't see it very well on the map here, but along the Rhine River, there were some very important bishoprics, or rather archbishoprics. The Bishop of Speyer, for instance, was a very important official. The Archbishop of Mainz was one of the most powerful men in all of Germany. Same with the Bishop of Köln or Cologne, as that's said in English. And these were more than just ecclesiastical officials. They were territorial lords over the whole area surrounding the archdiocese or the diocese they belonged to. I had the privilege of spending a semester a couple of years ago in the city of Würzburg, which is right here. Flagler College has a student-faculty exchange program going with them, with the university there. And one of the things that becomes readily apparent if you go to a place like Würzburg, which was an episcopal city in the Middle Ages, is that these bishops were for many centuries incredibly wealthy and incredibly powerful. In Würzburg, there is a large castle up on top of one of the hills overlooking the city center. Some of this dates back to the Middle Ages. That was the residence of the Bishop of Würzburg. He later built another palace in the town. Of course, you got the prominent cathedral. And the bishop had lots and lots of land that he was the owner of in the Middle Ages and in later periods as well. So that gives a good indication of how powerful these officials were. So the German lands, the former East Frankish Empire, was broken up into these territories that were dominated by these territorial lords, some of them dukes and counts, others of them bishops or archbishops. And after a while, the Carolingian line just died out, and they were left really without a king. And so one of the nobles who was powerful in Germany, the Duke of Saxony, up here in the northeastern part of Germany, his capital, as it were, was the city of Magdeburg. You can see it right here where I'm pointing. But he convinced the other nobles in Germany that he should have the title of king. And thus began a new dynasty to replace the previous dynasty. This was in the first half of the 10th century. And this dynasty is known as the Ottonian dynasty because the most prominent members of it were all named Otto. That's the origin of that name. Otto I, who ruled in the mid-10th century, looked back at Charlemagne's taking of the title of emperor and decided that the king of Germany, like Charlemagne, should hold the title of Roman emperor. And so he took a whole retinue of people and traveled down to the south here, to the city of Rome, and in a manner similar to that of Charlemagne, he was crowned by the Pope as emperor, the Pope whom he had persuaded that he should have that title, right? So the Ottonian dynasty began, and this is why Germany in the Middle Ages is called the Empire or the Roman Empire, and sometimes the name Holy Roman Empire is put on that, though that's mostly a later term from the early modern period, from about the 16th century. But the German king claimed to be the Roman emperor in the vein of Charlemagne, right? Now, the irony of all of this is that these German kings / emperors really did not hold a lot of power outside of their own territory that they had been dukes over, right? So these new kings, these Ottonian kings, were really only powerful up here in Saxony. These other nobles, the bishops and archbishops, along the major rivers, the Duke of Bavaria, the counts of various other parts, counts and markgraves and other nobles, essentially said to the king slash emperor, "Leave us alone. We don't want anything to do with you. We don't, you have no power in our jurisdiction. We're okay with you being king or even emperor, but leave us alone." Right? We will call you our lord and everything, but you cannot meddle in our affairs. And largely, over the course of the High Middle Ages, the major theme, political theme that we see in Germany is the effort on the part of the German kings, and this follows through three dynasties: the Ottonian dynasty, which dies out by the early 11th century, followed by the Salian dynasty, which runs from the second quarter of the 11th century for about a century into the middle of the 12th century, and then the Hohenstaufen dynasty begun by Frederick I, otherwise known as Frederick the Great or Frederick Barbarossa. Barbarossa means red beard, thus the name. The Hohenstaufen dynasty. All of these emperors, no matter which dynasty we're talking about, were eager to figure out a way to get more power inside of the German lands, or the lands they claimed as part of their empire. Now, there were a variety of means that they employed to do this. I don't want to talk about absolutely everything here. Let me mention two ways that they sought to accomplish this. First of all, they often entered into partnerships with other corporate entities, we might call them, communities would be another word, who were eager to gain independence. Now, from the last lecture, when we talked about the rise of towns, it should be apparent that towns or cities were at the top of the list of institutions that were trying to gain independence. Cities who had procured independence, were governing themselves for the most part, at least in many cases, were interested in entering into a close relationship with the emperor, where the emperor would become the overlord of the city. Why, you might ask, would they do that? Why would they subject themselves to the emperor? Well, the answer is that the emperor was further away from the territorial lord who also at times claimed jurisdiction over these cities, right? So, for instance, and so these cities are called imperial cities, okay? There is a city about right here. It's not on this map, but it's called Nuremberg, or Nürnberg, is how they say it in German. And the city of Nuremberg, decided to form this relationship with the emperor. He guaranteed that he would provide protection for them, that he would keep others out of their affairs if they gave him the honor, so to speak, of being the city's direct lord, and if they paid taxation to him and provided other services for him. The emperors tended to claim or to recruit soldiers and things like that out of imperial cities as well. So, in exchange for some obligations, the city of Nuremberg became an imperial city, which freed them from the demands of the Duke of Bavaria or of the Bishop of Würzburg or the Bishop of Bamberg, both of which are fairly close to Nuremberg, all of whom were trying to exert control over that city, which was burgeoning and becoming an important economic center. They would rather be in a relationship with the emperor than these others who were closer, who could, as they saw it, interfere in their lives more readily, right? So that's one way that these emperors sought to extend their authority, was to form these relationships with corporate entities like cities who acknowledged the emperor as their direct lord rather than going through the duke or the count or the bishop or something like that. And in fact, many churchmen, in an effort to free themselves from churchmen who outranked them, even entered into relationships with the emperors. Okay, this is going to lead to an important conflict that we'll talk about in a few minutes here. The other way, another way, I should say, there are several, but this is the other way I'm going to talk about. The other way that the German emperors sought to extend their reach politically was to exert direct control over the cities of northern Italy, which northern Italy had technically belonged to the Carolingian Empire, but it was difficult to govern this place directly. It had been part of the Middle Kingdom under Lothar, the grandson of Charlemagne. And most importantly, Italy was home to the largest and most commercially viable cities in Western Europe. Cities that generated tremendous wealth. And because of that wealth, wanted to govern themselves, wanted independence. You can see the names of some of the cities here. Here's Genoa, okay. Here's Turin. Looking here, here's Bologna, which became one of the first two sites of having a university. Up here you have Venice, okay, and so forth and so on, right? This is Trent, or Trient is how that's said in Italian. In any case, all of these cities were, becoming large, becoming very productive. Wealthy people lived in them and exerted political control over them. And so these cities wanted to be independent. Well, the German emperors knew that it would be far more lucrative for them to expend their efforts trying to bring these Italian cities to heel, as it were, rather than waste their time, trying to push back the territorial claims of the lords in Germany, because any one of the cities in Italy could generate more income and thus more taxation than, that would be the equivalent probably of ruling an entire duchy or a massive archbishopric or something like that. In fact, probably far more than the latter there. And so these German emperors spent a lot of time in Italy. It wasn't just the effort to contain the cities. The German emperors also were rivals with the popes in this period, something I'll talk about in a moment here. So these German emperors spent a good deal of time in Italy. They tried to create political alliances via marriage with important Italian families, including the kings of Sicily. That was eventually realized under a ruler named Frederick II in the first half of the 13th century, and so threatening was Frederick's claims that he could technically claim to rule both Germany and Italy, because he was heir to the kingdom of Sicily, which included southern Italy, through his mother, and through his father he was heir of the German Empire. And this left, of course, the Pope, who controlled these lands in the kind of lavender color here, right in the middle of Frederick's two kingdoms. And the popes tried to push back against this and make him promise that he would never try to be king of both of these territories at the same time. And Frederick was a really kind of controversial character. He's also a very capable king and a very interesting, one of the most interesting individuals in all the Middle Ages. But so you can see the kind of reach that the German emperors at least claimed, but they did have a hard time bringing these Italian cities into any kind of obedience to the German emperors. The cities, because they were wealthy, they could raise their own armies, pay mercenaries, and they frequently did, to fight against the claims of the German emperors. And sometimes the emperors got the upper hand, and sometimes the cities of Italy used their armies to gain the upper hand. In 1183, for instance, Frederick Barbarossa was forced to sign a kind of treaty with these Italian cities, proclaiming that they could continue to be independent, that they would pay a minimum of taxation to the empire, and that he would not try to extend his authority there. Of course, he later broke that, and his heirs broke that too, but this is the kind of thing that these cities could force, right? Now, I said that the German emperors were frequently in conflict with the popes, and to understand why that is the case, we need to spend a little time talking about the church in the High Middle Ages. Okay, um, the church after the breakup of the Carolingian Empire was in a real fix. It was a mess. It was corrupt. Um, the position of pope was pretty much, in the 10th century at least, the prize for whichever prominent family happened to be on the top of the heap in Rome. There were some, really powerful noble families, some of whom they probably fabricated this, but traced their ancestry back to the old patrician lines of Rome, and these jockeyed for position in central Italy. And without the kind of regulating influence of the Carolingian monarchs, Charlemagne had gone to pull the church out of a mess a number of times, as did Louis the Pious. And in the absence of a strong Carolingian ruler, the papacy became just tremendously corrupt. A good example of this is the 10th century Pope John the 12th. John was the scion of one of these powerful families in Rome, and he seemingly at the time he was elected pope, the family was just looking for any member of that family to be pope, just so they could control the office. And it seems nobody was terribly interested, and so they finally settled on John, who was only 18 years old at the time. So he became pope at age 18. I don't think he had any training as a clergyman, had not been a monk or anything like that, or really even educated in the church and theology or anything. And John, was he had the temperament and interests of hopefully I'm not insulting anyone here, but a college frat boy. He had a real taste for alcohol. He had a lot of mistresses. He used his position as Pope to, get all the booze and sex that he wanted, pretty much. And he reigned for only 8 years, at which point he died, according to the chroniclers who wrote about him after a night of partying with his mistress. Had a heart attack or something like that, right, at age 26. And needless to say, with the popes doing things like this, and they weren't the only ones. There were lots of clergymen, lots of members of the papal bureaucracy who were caught up in this corruption and in rampant misbehavior. Needless to say, the church was not taken very seriously. It was even held in derision by many people. And so the church was badly in need of reform, and specifically it needed for someone, churchmen, to exert control over powerful positions rather than these positions, whether we're talking about the Pope or a powerful bishopric or archbishopric or something like that, because this corruption was not just endemic in Rome. It was, the church had problems like this all over the place, all over Western Europe. Powerful noble families would lay claim to church offices and put, one of the members of their family in that church office, really just to hold power, right? Because these clergymen were involved in making decisions and settling disputes and things like this. And so if a family can control one of these key positions in the church, they control a lot. They have a lot of power, right? And so somebody needed to wrest that decision-making power in the church away from the existing structures of secular power, from the noble and royal families. And initially, ironically, the German emperors kind of set themselves up as the ones to see to reform. Ironic because of what happens later, which I'll talk about. Right now, there were 3 issues that animated the efforts at reform that began in the early 11th century. There was a group of churchmen, mostly in Rome, though they did have people interested in this kind of thing all over Europe. And the idea of reform was one of the truly key animating forces at work in high medieval Europe in the 11th and 12th centuries. There were three issues that these reform-minded churchmen targeted for change, right? One of these is the issue of simony. Simony means buying and selling church offices. This was in many places, maybe most places in Europe, standard operating procedure. A noble family who wanted to secure a bishopric or an archbishopric for one of the members of their own family, or for an ally or something like that, would essentially pay off those who made the decision about who got to be the next bishop, which would mean the clergymen in the cathedral, the canons as they were called of the cathedral. This is how the churches raised money. In fact, this is how they built new churches and how they beautified the churches with all kinds of ornamentation and things like this. Is they auctioned off, as it were, these offices. And so these noble families had great control over the church in any given area in Europe. Well, that needed to change. The buying and selling of church offices needed to change. A second issue, the fancy term for this is Nicolaitism. That means clerical, let's put it simply, clergymen having sex. All right. It could mean having concubines or even wives, being married. It had been an ideal since about the 3rd century for Christian clergymen, especially in the West, in the Latin Christian world, to be celibate. That was what was supposed to happen. And so this is a long-standing kind of policy in the church. But most churchmen in this period probably were not celibate. Some of them married, had kind of an open marriage, as it were, advertised, everybody knew they were married. Others took concubines, so kind of women of uncertain status exactly, but who were living with the bishop or the archbishop in question. Others simply took mistresses, right? And this was kind of expected. It was pretty standard, pretty standard practice. And these reformers said, we got to stop this, because you can imagine all kinds of problems coming from this. The mistress or the wife or the concubine might exert influence over decisions made in the church, and that was abhorrent to many of these clergymen. If clergymen are having sex, then they're violating the commandments of Christianity as laid out in the Bible, at least as understood by people in this era. They worried about some of the positions becoming hereditary. If a clergyman has children, he's going to want to pass on his bishopric or whatever it is to his children, right? And that can lead to more and more corruption. So that was another issue. The third issue, and the one that ultimately became the most heated, was the issue of lay investiture. That's kind of a fancy term. It essentially means the practice of laymen appointing their own church leaders in the territory they control. So, as an example, the German emperors would get to name the Archbishop of Mainz, which fell within their territory, or the Bishop of Würzburg, or the Bishop of Regensburg, or something like that. Okay. Again, this was standard operating procedure. We could go back to the days of Charlemagne, or even all the way back to Constantine, and see these kings and emperors practicing lay investiture, appointing their own churchmen. The reformers said, this has got to stop. The one who should have the say and who gets to hold the church office is the Pope. And it should be the Pope alone who makes that kind of decision, right? So this group of reformers got the ear of some of the popes in this period. Pope Leo IX, as an example, was a cousin of the German emperor and became pope largely through the German emperor Henry III working the system. But Henry truly wanted to see the church reformed, and Leo was a good candidate for this. He had a personality that lent itself to that, and Leo quickly surrounded himself with advisors who had reform in mind. And famously, Leo went on a kind of tour of France, where he met with bishops from all over France at these meetings called synods. And at these synods, he would tend to strip some of the churchmen of their offices if he found that they were guilty of simony. And so these popes are beginning to send a message. Reform became heated and became a true political controversy, though, in the second half of the 11th century. Leo was right around mid-century, about 20 years after Leo. This guy right here, pictured in the on the slide in the manuscript illustration, whose name was Gregory. Well, his name was actually Hildebrand, but he took the name Gregory the Seventh when he became pope, and he had been a close advisor of Leo the Ninth. He was one of the kind of minds behind the whole reform movement. He became pope and decided almost immediately upon assuming that office to pick a fight with the German emperor over the issue of lay investiture. The German emperor at the time was quite a young man. He had become emperor when he was only 6 years old. There was a period of regency where many of the nobles of Germany had kind of broken away from him, had rescinded their allegiance. Henry was in a fix, as it were. He had just reached his majority, was dealing with all of this, and Gregory saw a chance to exploit the political weakness of the German emperor. And so he wrote a letter to the emperor after he found out that the emperor had appointed one of the bishops in his realm, had invested him in the practice of lay investiture. And he told him that this was not allowed, and that this, if he persisted with this, that he would in fact find himself outside of the church. The Pope, exercised the privilege of excommunicating people if they didn't do what he wanted them to do. And Henry was really quite flabbergasted at this. He just had no idea what was going on. This was totally unprecedented. How dare the Pope say that he can meddle in the affairs of my kingdom, whether it's the church or not? And so this ended up in open conflict between the two. It's quite a dramatic sequence of events. I don't have time to narrate it to you in this lecture, but I do teach medieval Europe as one of my upper division classes. If you're interested in issues like this, want to learn more, come take that from me. But otherwise, read. There's a wonderful set of correspondence that has survived between these two rulers, and it makes for really good reading. It's like trash talking medieval style. They're both insulting each other as they, make these proclamations about the power that they have and the other doesn't have. Now, in the midst of this, Pope Gregory VII produced a document known as the Dictatus Papae. I'll come back to these points in a minute. I want to take a look at some of the points from this document. So this was written during the investiture controversy in the 1070s or 1080s. And one of the things that we have to know about this document is that this is an expression of an ideal, right? This is not the Pope laying down the law and saying, this is truly how things are, though he kind of talks like that. There are very few people who would have gone along with the Pope. Even many churchmen would have seen these declarations of papal authority as offensive, as problematic, as troublesome, as totally unwelcome, right? But Gregory, in this document, envisions a world where everyone is Christian and the Pope is at the head of all of it, right? He is the only real authority in the entire world because he is the only one who speaks directly for God, right? And so let's take a look at a few of the details here of the Dictatus Papae. This may be something you see on the final exam, one of the texts that I might test you on. So this is not the whole document. I've just drawn out a few points here, right? So he says the Roman Church was founded by God alone. And what he means by that is that the Roman Church alone was founded by God. All these earthly kingdoms are man-made creations. Well, the kings claim to be ruling by divine right, and so this was terribly offensive to them. And, certainly the German emperors looked back at Charlemagne as an example, and you should have read by this point in the class the lives of Charlemagne, and Einhard and Knocker both talk about Charlemagne being this, being favored by God and ruling at the behest of God himself. Well, the Pope is saying, no, that's not the case at all. And he extends that by saying that the Roman pontiff, meaning the Pope, alone can with right be called universal. The question of universals, what is truly universal? This is an extension of Aristotelian philosophy with categorization and things like that. But the question of universals was one of the central things that animated intellectuals in this period. What things are larger than others? Really, is the question. Is there anything that is truly universal, that everything in the world or in the universe can be said to belong to? And the Pope is laying claim to that, right? That he is the only universal authority operating in the world because he is the vicar of Christ. There's some practical matters here that if he wants to make an abbey of a canonry, these are just different kinds of church institutions, or to divide a rich bishopric and unite the poor ones, or anything like this, to assemble together new congregations, or so forth and so on, the Pope is the only one who can do this. Well, he says that because it was common practice for kings and emperors to do those kinds of things, right? That he alone may use the imperial insignia, meaning the accoutrements, the symbols of office of the Roman Empire, right? The imperial insignia. The Pope is claiming to be the only legitimate emperor, in other words, the true heir of the universal authority of the ancient Roman Empire. This would have been, of course, terribly offensive to the German emperors who laid claim to that title, and probably to the emperors in Constantinople too, although they seem to have been, well, actually there were controversies with them as well during this period. Now, a couple of the ones, I'm going to skip over a few here. A couple of these are truly radical in their statements. That the Roman Church has never erred, nor will it err to all eternity, the Scripture bearing witness, right? The Church has never made a mistake, nor will it ever make a mistake. I don't think that Gregory VII was ignorant of, the corruption of the papacy. I think what he means is when a pope, or when the Church has been acting in accordance with God's will, that it doesn't make a mistake. And this is the kind of the beginnings of the doctrine of papal infallibility, which only became part of church law in the 19th century, but has its roots back here in this high medieval setting. This last one may be the most radical in terms of its social statement. Gregory says that the Pope may absolve subjects from their fealty to wicked men. Now we need to know what the term fealty means there. Fealty means loyalty, but it's more than that. In the Middle Ages, people would swear their allegiance, usually in some kind of ritual, with priests present and crosses and relics and God as the witness, as it were. They would swear their allegiance to a lord, right? This was especially the case for noblemen. So, a knight or someone of lesser status, like a baron or something like that, would, hypothetically speaking here, swear his allegiance to the duke or to the king or to the emperor. And they would, go through this ritual where they would kneel before their lord and make certain gestures toward him of supplication. The Lord would then reciprocate and make gestures of magnanimity, and all of this would be remembered with witnesses there. And when written documents came into use at a high level in this same period, one of the most common documents that was produced, one of the most common kinds of documents, I should say, that was produced, were these accounts of these kinds of agreements, with a whole list of witnesses who were there to make sure that this was ratified and it was done properly, right? And so we're talking about the very social fabric, the way people defined themselves in this period. And Gregory is simply saying, I can undo all of that. If, a man is wicked, and by this he really means if the emperor is wicked, if he is not in the favor of the Roman Church, in the bosom of the Church, would be the terminology there, then none of his subjects actually have to listen to him. They don't have to come through on their obligations of fealty. This, by the way, these fealty relationships are similar in some ways to the patron-client relationships that we talked about in the Roman period. They were, though, imbued with all sorts of Christian meaning, evocations of God, and again, rituals that were kind of backed up by clergy and things like this. So the Pope is making a really radical set of statements here. Again, there were a lot of people who simply could not get on board with this. Even many clergymen took the side of the emperor, which is one of the things that dragged the conflict out for so long. In the end, both sides had to compromise. Gregory's vision of a united, Christendom with the Pope as its head didn't really come to full fruition. He, in fact, died in exile from Rome under the care, one might say house arrest, of the Norman ruler of Sicily, who was his ally, but also, kind of he's using the Pope as leverage. And Henry had control of Rome at the time, militarily had control of Rome, and had proclaimed, had held a kind of sham election to elect a new Pope to replace Gregory, right? Which was not held in favor by many people, maybe most people. And so the conflict continued for another couple of generations until finally they came to a sort of agreement in the year 1122 called the Concordat of Worms, which stated that the popes were the ones who really got to appoint church officials, but that they would listen to and heed the advice of the German emperors within their realm, right? So it's a compromise. There were still lots of conflicts between the popes and various kings in this period. Okay, now back to the popes. Now, starting with Gregory VII, this movement of reform really got going. All through the 12th century, it was precipitated. Not only in Rome, but on the local level, all over Europe, bishops and abbots and other churchmen got on board with this notion of reform, began to push for the arguments of reform within their own spheres, and this lent great power to the papacy. There were a number of very capable popes in this period who extended their authority. There were a lot of institutions created at this time. One of them, created in the 11th century, is called the College of Cardinals, which became responsible and remains the case all the way to the present for the election of the popes, taking it out of the hands of the noblemen and the emperors and others who had meddled in that election. Right? The churchmen, in other words, are the ones to make that decision. The church also came to have its own legal system known as canon law in this period. It had its own legislative wing. The popes would occasionally call councils to ratify some of the programs and things that they had started. And all of these councils in this period were held in Rome at the personal residence at the church, kind of home church of the Pope, which was the Church of St. John Lateran. The Vatican, by the way, was not really around at this point. The Vatican is created in the 16th century, so the Pope was using different churches and had a different residence in this period of time. It could be said that the church also had a military wing, that the popes called for that, and this is in the form of the Crusades. I will talk about the Crusades in a moment here, but I just want to finish up the point about papal monarchy. Really, the popes become monarchs. They have all of the structures of government. It is unique to the papacy, but they still have them. They rivaled both in terms of their territorial authority, their territorial holdings, and the pressure they exerted on other powers in Europe. They held the same authority or greater authority than any king in Europe in this period. Papacy reached a height at the beginning of the 13th century with the reign of Innocent III. He is pictured here in a painting from this period. And Innocent was responsible for quite a lot of things. He helped to continue the process of the creation of canon law. He held a major council known as the Fourth Lateran Council, which really represents, again, the height of church power under the control of the papacy. He called for the Fourth Crusade, He did a number of things that demonstrated how powerful he was. Innocent had the vision, the same vision as Gregory VII had in the 11th century, but was in many ways more in a better position and more capable of carrying it out. The papacy will decline, and we may get to talk about that later in the course. But by the time of the late Middle Ages, the papacy is only about a century after Innocent III. The papacy is already falling on hard times and being taken advantage of by other powers in Europe. But there was this heyday in the 12th and early 13th centuries when they truly were the most powerful lords in all of Europe. The Crusades is a good manifestation of that, right? Although these weren't personally directed by the popes in every instance, or really in any instance, the popes were the ones to call for crusade. These are some of the more famous incidents from the Middle Ages. I don't want to give a truly exhaustive account of crusades here, but the whole crusading movement was inspired by two or three factors that we should enumerate briefly here. One of these is that Christians had from ancient times, from antiquity, made journeys to holy sites in a practice called pilgrimage. And the holiest sites of all for Christians were, of course, those sites over here in Jerusalem and in other areas where Jesus had lived, where the Bible took place. And Constantine, among others, had identified some of these sites. He decided that the birth of Jesus took place in a certain exact location and built a church there called the Church of the Nativity. Another place was identified as the spot where Jesus was crucified and placed in a tomb and resurrected, and that was known as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And all of these things are in Jerusalem. There were other churches kind of interspersed throughout the Levant, all associated with these biblical events, right? Well, with the Muslim conquest of the Levant, Christian pilgrims sometimes had a difficult time getting to these sites. If a Muslim ruler was unfriendly to this flow of Christian pilgrims, they could make their lives difficult. And this is not to say that they hurt them on a frequent basis, but that's probably, there was this perception, though, that these lands were not safe for Christians. In the year 1009, a Turkish leader in that area, Muslim leader, decided that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was a nuisance, that it was an offense to his Islamic faith, and so he ordered it to be destroyed. And he even destroyed the rock tomb that was inside of that church, which was believed to be the legitimate tomb of Jesus Christ. Right? And so these, the news of the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the problems that Christian pilgrims were having leaked to the West and certainly grew in the telling. And so the popes decided to call for Christian knights to go off to the Holy Land and fight to restore these pilgrimage routes. And most of the people who went on these crusades, in fact, saw themselves as pilgrims. Pilgrimage was a penitential act. One would be forgiven of one's sins. And in fact, the Pope who called for the First Crusade, Urban II, at the city of Clermont, here in kind of central France, made a promise that all of the knights who would take up the banner of crusade would receive what was called a plenary indulgence, which was a kind of blanket forgiveness of sins, right? So that thus began the First Crusade. Now, there were a couple of other things motivating this, right? One of these was the growing divide, which had become fully a schism by this point, between the Latin-speaking Western Church and the Greek-speaking Eastern Church. Okay, this had become heated over the centuries. Charlemagne and people in his day even got into a kind of a series of theological arguments with Greek churchmen over issues that would sound to us like hair splitting. but were considered quite important for them, right? There were things that the Eastern Church and the Western Church simply did not agree on. In the year 1054, a papal legate, a papal messenger, in the employ of Pope Leo IX, the guy whose name was Humbert. Humbert was, along with Hildebrand, who became Gregory VII, one of the key reform minds in Rome in this period. Humbert was sent on a mission to a kind of embassy mission, ambassadorial mission to the emperor in Constantinople. And while he was there, he got into an argument with the Patriarch of Constantinople, and Humbert, with evoking papal authority, said that he excommunicated the Patriarch, and the Patriarch responded by saying that he was excommunicating the Pope. This was the year 1054, and that led to a full-scale schism that was not healed for some time. In fact, arguably, it's never really been healed, not fully anyway. And so, this led to this divide, and the Greeks, the Byzantines, were fighting off these Muslims. They had called occasionally for knights from the West to come and help them in this fight. What they really wanted probably were mercenaries. The Byzantine emperors, Emperor Alexius, in fact, had called for a few thousand Christian knights to come and aid his cause. He was probably just going to pay them, and once they had finished their task, he would send them home. No strings attached or anything like that. Interestingly, what Alexius got was about 500,000 people, some of them knights, and some of them just peasants who got caught up in the fervor of this and wanted to go off to the Holy Land and receive forgiveness of their sins and all of that, right? So the Byzantine emperors really didn't want anything to do with this, and they sort of ferried the Crusaders over the Bosporus and said, good luck with all that, right? They didn't lend them any help. This angered the Crusaders, but they decided that whatever they claimed, would be theirs rather than giving it to the Byzantine emperor. The First Crusade was the only one of the major crusades that could be called a success, and only so because the Muslim world was at the time in some political disarray. The Holy Land was split between different factions of Muslims. There was no kind of central authority to prop all of this up. And so the Crusaders caught them in a compromised position. Even still, it took years of fighting and years of blundering for them to finally reach Jerusalem and besiege the city and finally take it. Now, after the First Crusade, these Crusaders, the leaders of the Crusade, which included, by the way, not a single king. The leaders of the First Crusade were mostly younger sons of noble or royal families. One of the sons of William the Conqueror went on crusade, for instance, and one of the sons of the King of Sicily, a guy named Bohemond of Taranto, went on crusade, and each of them claimed their own territory and ended up dividing up the Levant into 4 major political entities. The county of Edessa, headed by a count, the county of Tripoli here, the Principality of Antioch, and finally the Kingdom of Jerusalem, under the rule of a Latin-speaking Western European king. Now, those 4 Crusader states, as they were called, had a difficult time holding on to this territory because, and this is where we get at the motivations of people, that's been a debated point in historical circles. Why did people go on crusade? Early authors of this said, well, they're just greedy. They wanted land. They wanted easy conquest and money and things like this. Well, that flies in the face of the evidence. 90+% of all the knights who went on the First Crusade, and in fact on subsequent crusades, once they had reached the Holy Land and fulfilled the vow they had made, turned around and went home with their plenary indulgence tucked neatly under their arm, figuratively speaking, right? In other words, they seem to have been motivated by genuine religious fervor and especially by a desire to have their sins forgiven. The same thing that motivated pilgrimage. They saw themselves primarily as pilgrims rather than as warriors. At least that's what seems to be the case. And so these rulers in the Holy Land who did claim land had a hard time maintaining it because they simply didn't have enough soldiers. This led later popes to call for more and more crusades, and ultimately there were about 8 or 9 major crusades and several minor crusades. Some of the crusades were prompted by the Muslims retaking land. The Second Crusade, for instance, began in the 1140s when the county of Edessa was retaken by the Muslims. Interestingly, the French King Louis VII, who led this crusade, never got close to Edessa, decided to attack Damascus instead, which had really no part in this. This was a foolhardy enterprise, and his men were surrounded and forced to surrender, and Louis went back home in shame, having accomplished absolutely nothing. The Third Crusade happened because of the Muslim reconquest of Jerusalem in the year 1187 by the Muslim ruler Salah ad-Din, or Saladin as he was known, right? And the Third Crusade, even though it was led by 3 kings, Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, did not succeed militarily, partly because Frederick died en route, and most of his soldiers turned around and went back to Germany to settle who would be the next king. The French king Philip II got there and decided he had fulfilled his vow and turned around and went back home without fighting for the most part, and Richard the Lionheart was the only one left there to fight against Saladin, and didn't succeed in taking any new land, or taking any land back. The Fourth Crusade was the biggest disaster of them all. This one called by Innocent III, who decided that all of these kings had botched the Crusades and he wanted to be in charge. That didn't mean he was going to go on crusade, but he was going to direct this through messengers. Well, the thing pretty quickly got away from him. He organized with the Venetians to provide ships for the Crusaders. When the Crusaders showed up, they didn't have enough money or men to really to make this journey. The Venetians would not let them go without paying, and the Venetians kind of hijacked the crusade. The Crusader army came down at the behest of the Venetians and conquered the city of Zara, which was a Christian city and a trading rival of Venice. Thus, they eliminated their greatest trading rival in the Adriatic. It later came down all the way to Constantinople because there was a guy who showed up in the Crusader camp claiming to be the legitimate emperor in Constantinople. And he said he would provide an army and money and all these things for them if they went to Constantinople. The Venetians, smelling profit, agreed to this. And ultimately, the Crusader army, after they put this guy on the throne, found out that he was penniless and that all of the resources had been stolen from the city by others. And so they finally got frustrated and ended up breaking into Constantinople and sacking the city and stealing pretty much everything that was not tacked down, and probably a few things that were, including lots and lots of Christian relics and sacred vessels and things like this from churches in Constantinople. So there was a robust trade in relics and other implements from the Greek world for several decades after this, right? Not a single subsequent crusade, and I haven't talked about all of them. There are others on the map here. Not a single crusade succeeded in winning a military victory after the First Crusade, at least not a significant one that took a lot of territory. The last Crusader stronghold, Acre, pictured here, fell in the year 1291. There were Crusader organizations, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller and others, that set up headquarters out here on some of these islands in the Mediterranean, Cyprus and Rhodes and some of these places, but they were never able to get back to the Holy Land. It should be said that the desire for crusades lasted for a long time. When Columbus wrote a letter in 1492 to announce to Ferdinand and Isabella that he had made it to Asia, as he thought. He'd really, of course, found the Bahamas in the Americas and Cuba. But he said, one of the benefits of this is that I can, bring you back a whole bunch of soldiers from the natives here who will easily convert to Christianity, and then you can take them as an army to conquer the Holy Land. So 2 centuries after the fall of Acre, the King and Queen of Spain were still thinking very strongly about starting a new crusade. Right? It should also be said that not all crusades went to the Holy Land. There were crusades called in other places, in Spain, for instance, which over the course of the High Middle Ages managed to push back, the Christians managed to push back the Muslims, taking the last Muslim stronghold of Granada down here on the coast by the Strait of Gibraltar in the year 1492. There were crusades called to the northeastern part of Europe here, where many people were still pagan. There were even crusades called within Europe against heretics, something that I'll talk about some in the next lecture. But the Crusades are a rather shameful chapter in Western history, I think. They certainly were not. I mean, they were very brutal. Lots of people lost their lives. A lot of religious intolerance. I don't want to be judgmental necessarily on the medieval mind here, but they really were not terribly successful, and a lot of people were killed as a result of this. Now, let's finish up by talking about France and England. Like Germany, France had been part of the Carolingian Empire, and specifically the West Frankish Empire. And like as happened in Germany, the Carolingian lines died out sometime in the late 9th or early 10th century, leaving France in the hands of powerful nobles who had wrested land and power away from the Carolingian monarchs, who had defended their people against Viking invasions and Muslim invasions. And so the map of France ended up as a real patchwork of counties, duchies, principalities, and so forth and so on, right? With the dying out of the Carolingians, a new dynasty, again, this is very similar to Germany, claimed the title of king. This dynasty's power base was in the city of Paris and the surrounding regions. The surname of these kings was Capet, so they're known as the Capetian dynasty. And much as in Germany, in fact even more so, the French kings only held real authority in the land around Paris, this land in the darker green here, which was known as the royal demesne, or the royal domain. Right? And the French kings, over the course of the High Middle Ages, tried desperately, and in fact succeeded, far better than the German emperors did, at wresting power away from the other nobles, at consolidating power under their rule, right? They did this through, and so the French kings, who were the weakest of all the kings of Western Europe at the beginning of this period, ended up, at the close of this period, as by far the strongest of all of the monarchs. How did they do this? Well, 3 things here. One was they had stable succession for 3 centuries. There was always a clear heir. There was never a conflict over who should be the next king. It was always very clear, and so they didn't have the problems that come from conflict over the throne. A second one was that they married extremely well. These kings married into the noble families of all of these other, who controlled all these other territories in France. And by marriage, these lands ended up passing into the hands of the French kings. This didn't always go smoothly, by the way. I mentioned Louis VII, who led the Second Crusade. He had married extremely well to the Duchess of Aquitaine, which included, she was the heiress, legitimate heiress, of kind of all of this territory in central France here, Poitou and La Marche and these other places. This was all her lands. Her name was Eleanor of Aquitaine. And so Louis came into possession of that, but they were not a very good match. Louis had been prepared for a career in the church, but then his older brother died, and so he was suddenly thrust into the kingship. Eleanor had been raised by an adventurous father who was a poet and an adventurer, a great lover, and she had these romantic notions about how the world worked. She demanded to go on crusade with her husband. He tried to oppose that, but she wouldn't take no for an answer. And while they were on crusade, the two ended up arguing over strategy. Eleanor sided with her uncle, who was the Prince of Antioch, and this is probably the reason that Louis decided to attack Damascus. In any case, after Louis's terrible defeat at the hands of the Muslims, he sort of stopped to pick up his wife, went back to France, and she promptly had the marriage annulled, thus taking her lands back. And then she got married to the Count of Anjou, who was in line to be the next king of England. And thus the lands of all of kind of Western France here fell into the hands of the guy who also controlled England. So I'll talk about that again in a moment. Now, despite these setbacks, they did make good marriages, and some of the kings, not Louis so much, but other kings in this period were excellent political maneuverers. Philip II of France, for instance, through a kind of courtly matter, managed to seize the lands of King John of England, who was the son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. And John could do little about this. And so this is how those lands ended up passing into the hands of the kings of France. Again, by the end of the High Middle Ages, by about 1300, with the reign of Philip IV, who was probably the most powerful of all the French kings in the Middle Ages, they had all of this territory quite secure in their own control. Now, these matters with England, and going back to Eleanor of Aquitaine and the two marriages, ended up being the source of conflict with England. So we really can't talk about France without discussing England as well. England was under the control of a dynasty who originated up here in Normandy, and even further back originated up in Scandinavia. William the Conqueror, who crossed the English Channel in 1066 and defeated the reigning monarch Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings, was a Norman, right? And so the Norman dynasty took over at that point. Before that, England had been kind of riven between two kingdoms, Wessex in the south, and then what was called the Danelaw in the north, which was a Scandinavian, the result of Viking invasions. The Vikings had carved out a kingdom for themselves there. Once the Vikings left, the King of Wessex claimed all of England, and then he was in turn defeated by William the Conqueror. And there's more to the story, but this is running a bit long, so we need to be moving on here, right? In any case, William did not give up his lands on the continent just because he became King of England. He still claimed the title of Duke of Normandy. Truth be told, he spent far more time in Normandy than he did in England. It was far more interesting to him, culturally, linguistically, and otherwise. But he did start a program of building castles and doing other things to consolidate control in England itself. Okay, this is a famous artwork called the Bayeux Tapestry, which details the conquest of William the Conqueror. In this scene, the Latin says "Hic," here. Harold Rex, Harold the King, interfectus est, Harold was killed. Right. So here you have Harold falling off of his horse in kind of stop motion fashion. One of the other features of the Bayeux Tapestry, by the way, is Halley's Comet, which appeared that same year and which the Normans took as a portent of God's favor for their project of conquering England. Okay, now this is the map in the mid to late 12th century, I should say. The kings of England controlled not only the lands of England and Normandy, but everything you see in various shades of pink here was also theirs. The counties of Maine and Anjou, the Duchy of Aquitaine, even down here to the Duchy of Gascony. These were all in the hands of the English monarchs. It was only through shrewd political maneuvering that Philip II was able to wrest these things away from King John. John was known henceforth as John Lackland for reasons that should be obvious here. Right? Okay. So, and this historical rivalry would continue all into the late Middle Ages when England and France end up fighting what is known as the 100 Years' War. That doesn't mean they fought steadily for 100 years. It happened in several phases, but it was all part of the same conflict, which was over English claims to land in France that go back to the Norman conquests. That got fairly heated, and the English at times took a lot of territory in France, but ultimately were evicted partly with the inspiration of a young woman named Joan of Arc, right? But that's the story for another class, certainly another lecture. Okay, thank you very much. Next lecture, we will talk about culture in the Middle Ages, both popular and high culture, and we will get into some of the texts that you have been assigned to read for this week. Thanks.